Hey Liv, this is the interview with Sarah Karlik for the Advancing Women in Sport podcast. Listeners, welcome back to the Advancing Women in Sport podcast. It is me again, and today I'm joined by Sarah Karlik. Now, Sarah is a woman in sport who wears a number of different hats, including athlete, worker in sport and academic. So without further ado, I'd love to introduce Sarah. And Sarah, when people say to you, what do you do? How do you answer them?
Well, depends on the day, depends on
Yep.
who's asking me. But I think for me, the hat that I'm trying to consciously promote is the researcher, since that's where I see myself transitioning into for my future is just transitioning out of sport as the player and transitioning more into this expert in women's football. So I feel like that's the hat that I try to lead most conversations with.
Awesome. So tell us a little bit about, what's the highlight reel of Sarah's career? Tell us how it started, how sport started, how it continued, and how it continues for you right now.
Oh my. I am pretty old in the sporting world, but for
You're not
me,
as old as
sports
me.
started. For me, sports started when I was 5, and I played every sport under the sun. I played basketball, swimming, karate, horseback riding. I ended up sticking with soccer and still play that to this day. So it's been 25 years now. So I'm 30. And it's been an incredible journey. I've had a lot of people, along the way and are still with me in my journey. I'm really blessed by the circle that is with me, currently, my dream team back home. And I have my dream team that's now here in Australia, which has become my second home. But I've certainly had a number of homes. I've been fortunate enough to play in 7 different states in the US at the amateur level, but have played overseas in Israel, Italy, some training environments in Iceland, and been to Australia twice. And like I said, now Australia is my home. So I've lived in Melbourne now for 2 years, and it's been a long journey. It's been a challenging journey, but I've learned a lot of lessons along the way, and I'm hoping that those lessons will prove valuable in being able to make a significant and positive difference in women's soccer specifically, but women's sport more broadly in the next chapter of my life.
Cool. And of course, one of the lessons that I know that you have learned and you practice is the power of networks and networking. And of course, we met a couple of years ago through the amazing Professor Emma Sherry. And Emma, for those listeners who haven't yet listened to season 1 of the podcast, Emma is featured as one of the guests on the podcast, and she gives some great insights. But she's an amazing connector as well, and she connected us a while back, Sarah, and I've really become so interested in the work that you do. And, as you said, you're an athlete right now, but that won't go on forever at the elite level. And your work in academia is super important. So tell us a bit about what your research is aiming to do and what you've learned already, because you're a fair way in, aren't you?
Yep. So I'm about to enter my final year of my PhD. So it'll be year 3 coming up, and it'll be a big year. Looking forward to it. But for me, my research project is looking at the lived experiences of international women's football players. And with the professionalization and globalization of women's football, this is a really unique time for me to be coming in and hopefully being able to use my research to inform future policy and practices to support and integrate international women's football players into the team, the club, and the country. And I have been, privileged to listen to the stories of international women's football players that are here in Melbourne, trusting me with their stories. But I'm also part of a network called the Players Network, which supports international women's football players that are all over the globe. And we're part of this community where we talk about challenges, talk about opportunities to play in another country, and just being, a really embracing community to help young women's players who are looking to start their careers abroad, but also continue the careers of the players that are looking for their next opportunity in another country.
Look, I think the research that then informs better practices in sport and sporting workplaces is always going to make my heart sing. So, right now, first call to action, listeners, long-time listeners will know I pepper these interviews with, here's your call to action. Call to action number one, please look up Sarah and her research, even the interim findings that she's had, but then look out for it, because this will be a playbook for workplaces or sporting workplaces that are not just in soccer or in the round ball game, but I think I imagine that there'll be learnings and lessons, applicable lessons for all sorts of players. Sarah, if I was to say to you, I assume that women have to play internationally or look around internationally to earn a wage. Would that be true?
So, depending on the country that you're living in, yes, at the present time, players are going to have to look abroad into another country to try to earn a living wage. It's very challenging for women athletes to be able to earn a wage that's able to support them. You're looking at the 1% of the one percenters. And so that's something where I'm hoping will change in the future, is looking at that investment. But looking at, again, for me, I'm interested in those practical considerations that clubs are able to take, where you may not necessarily be able to give a player all the dollar signs that person would want, or what their value actually is. But are there other practical things that you're able to do, whether that's looking at groceries, whether that's looking at car and car sponsorships? So there's still other ways that can help support, instead of just looking at that dollar sign. And so I think that is one thing that I want to mention when it comes to a living wage and how a player is able to survive playing and living in another country.
Great advice, and already my little cogs in my brain are turning to go, wow, if you look at just here in Australia, you look at the major supermarket chains, hey, I want to support women's sport. Okay, you may not have the dollars in your marketing or your sponsorship budget, but hey, how about you give these women $100 voucher every week so they can buy their groceries? Because, as you said, a living wage, how can I not just exist but thrive? Making sure that, well, if you look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, food, water, shelter, those are the things that we need to be able to play at our best. I hear this a lot, though. Okay, but what about the men? Is this the same for men's soccer? Is this the same for men trying to eke out a living on playing professional soccer?
Yeah. And as a player myself, it's incredibly frustrating with the years of experience and the wide range of experiences that I've had, where I still find it incredibly challenging trying to negotiate and talk about value. And you look at your male counterparts, and you are making a sixth of what these male players are making. And with the interviews that I have done with my study, I have a number of players who have partners that are playing as well, and some of them live in this country where they're playing, and they talk about salary and talk about the negotiation strategies and talk about the support and things like that. And it's like the men go, wait, you get what? The
Yeah.
conversations are like, what? And so it is really, really challenging, really frustrating to um, continue to talk about value, to talk about what we have and what the men have. It's really frustrating. It's disappointing. It's sad. It breaks my heart that we're continuing to have this conversation when we're seeing that investment that's pouring into women's football, particularly when you're looking at the back end of the World Cup and you look at the numbers and the support that we've had through there. I'm hoping that that's going to change in the future. But at the same time, I do think that it's important for players, female athletes, to be able to stand their ground and understand their value as well, and to shift that conversation away from just being grateful to
Mm,
have an opportunity to play professionally, to say, back yourself, and this is my value, this is why I have this value, this is what I can bring, and shifting it away from I'm just happy to play anywhere and get anything. And again, everybody has different motivations for playing, so I don't want to say that just playing abroad or playing in another country is your motivation, travel is your motivation, that that's where the conversation stops. It's I still want to play in another country, but I also know my value and standards when I'm going into those countries to play.
mm. I think well, I guess this is, I'm leading the witness, as they say, because you and I both know that the playing field is not level for women and men. And I have heard various expressions, like the playing field for men is a beautifully curated soccer field with all of the equipment, and the playing field for women is the back, way out in the outback or the desert, and there's craters and there's boulders and there's not even a bit of greenery anywhere. So visually, listeners, that's what it can feel like. But I have some statistics that I want to run by you, because this is kind of the problem. Is we've got a problem about the problem as well. So number one, 55% of people strongly believe that gender inequality exists in their sporting workplace, which means 45% don't, which that does my head in. 40% of people do not believe or are not sure that women are respected in their sporting workplace. 34%, just 34% of people believe that their workplace leaders are taking sufficient action to address gender inequality. So, there's evidence there, and like, this is not about me spouting off about my evidence and my research, because that comes in a whole different format. But the reality is there's a lot of people, and I know 88% of people who responded to me say, I've got a role to play around addressing gender inequality. But yet 45% of people surveyed say there isn't a problem. And I'm no statistician, clearly, but there's an uneven playing field. So as you've experienced the playing field as a player and now as a researcher, what are the instances, and I know we've touched on pay, but what are the other instances that you've experienced or observed about that uneven playing field?
Right. So as an athlete, I've predominantly been coached by men. So that's the first instant that comes to mind. Support staff has been men. The people that I've dealt with have been men. Agents have been men. So I see that a lot, still see that. But another instance that comes to my mind is, when I was back in the States, I remember when I was undertaking my master's degree, and I was the women's soccer team's graduate assistant at the university I was studying at. And I was going back to my hometown for summer break, and I was looking at possible places of employment that would be a good fit. Someone I knew recommended this one place that was new to the area, and it was a soccer performance business. And so I thought, let's check this out. But before I reached out, I did a little research, and I looked on their website and scrolled through the profiles of the staff. And there were two things that stood out to me right away. First, they were all men. And second, they all appeared to know each other, since on their bios it said that they were from the same or went to the same university. And I thought, okay. So when I got on a call with some of the guys that worked there, the conversation went really well. And I thought that we were gelling, and I felt comfortable when we were wrapping up and they asked if I had any questions. I said, yeah, I do have one. In my research, I noticed that there aren't any women coaches that are on staff. Why is that? And they laughed and they said, oh, yeah, well, we're working on that, but we just haven't found anyone in this area. And
Mm,
I thought, there's 3 million people living in this area. How is this possible? But I said, okay, well, I'm looking forward to joining the team and getting straight to work. And I was hired soon after that and ended up doing some pretty significant work with them for the short period of time that I had. And they gave me free reign to grow the business, particularly on the women's and the girls' side, while also coaching the young girls that came to train with them. But I remember those first few days shadowing the coaches and thinking, wow, there are a lot of young girls that come through here. And don't get me wrong, the coaches were great and with the girls, and the girls seemed to really enjoy working with them. But there was this one mother, when she met me, she just threw her arms up in the air and she goes, oh, finally, I've been asking for a female coach to get hired for so long. And just seeing what it meant to her, I can only imagine what it meant to her 9-year-old daughter standing next to her when we got introduced for the first time. But yeah, I see a lot of instances like that where it's predominantly male coaching staff, people that that know each other from growing up or went to uni together, and so hiring practices are a big concern, I think, that I see when it comes to leveling that playing field.
There might be people who would say, "Yeah, but Sarah, they're all really qualified. We only recruit coaches on merit, and they're all really qualified." But you and I both know that there's a dynamic that occurs. Gender dynamics start occurring, and even as women and girls, if we only see men in authority, that then starts to put an imprint on our brain and the way we cognite who is a leader from a very early age. What are the other implications? And I feel like I'm asking a really, really basic question here, but I feel like we've got to spell it out. What are the other implications for girls and women only having men coaches or male coaches?
I mean, I think it also comes down to, when we're talking about value and not just like the way that we perform as athletes on the field and try to advance ourselves in, our careers, whether it's as sports people or outside sport. But I think it shows up in the relationships that we have with other people, whether it's friends, our partners, colleagues, and so on. Because I think it changes the way, or it can potentially affect the way that we relate to other people when we're seeing it only through this position of power where we're dealing with male figures, and when we're not seeing those visible female role models. So I think that relationships and the way that we navigate through this life is one of the other implications of only seeing male role models or male figures. But again, it's not to take away from the men, because like I said in the example that I gave, the men were great with the girls, and
Yep.
so I don't want to say that that they don't have something to offer, but I do think that it's really important to be able to see women in positions of power, strong, capable, women that are leading the way, because you can't be what you can't see. Like, I do believe that, and that's definitely shaped the trajectory of where I'm currently seeing myself as a leader and what it is that I want to do in the next chapter of my life as well.
Totally agree with you, naturally. And part of that, to build on that, is when we see all sorts of different people in positions of power, authority, influence, our worldviews change, and the way we walk through the world changes. So yeah, and I think particularly for sport, this is a big call to action. So what is that? What is the call to action to a sporting administrator listening right now, Sarah? What do you want that what do you want them to do as a result of this part of the conversation?
Yeah, so for the people like in those positions where they're looking at the hiring practices, I alluded to that before. I think that that's something that really does need a considered, look at, specifically because I have a colleague who's been doing some fantastic work looking at the hiring practices of female coaches and has found that most women won't apply because the application process is part of the problem. And that's because of social inequities and social conditioning. And many women fear failure. And therefore, an application process is like a set of rules about who that job is for. And often women don't think that it's for them. And so the cost of applying is then the risk of failure. And so the application process is also not flexible. And so women who are more time poor than men have less time to then apply for that application. And so more progressive organizations actively seek to hire. So that would be, the call to action there. It just takes more time and effort, which is why many organizations don't want to invest in that.
Can you give me an example of those hiring practices not being inclusive of women, or that may be inadvertently placing a barrier in front of a woman applying?
Well, I think that the work-life balance is something that's comes to mind straight away. Like when you're looking at, female coaches, not taking into consideration caretaking could be, potential barrier and challenge when it comes to the hiring, where men aren't necessarily seen as that caretaker role. And so looking at that is something that I think is worthy of consideration when it comes to the hiring practices, and being flexible when it comes to the hours that an employee is able to work. But that goes for the women and for the men too. So I
Yeah.
think that it's been, primarily for the men that's been favored. And when it comes to the women, it's just seen as a burden or something that organizations aren't necessarily as accepting. So work-life
Mm.
balance.
Mm. Yeah, and certainly, for transparency, I sit on the advisory board of family-friendly workplaces, and part of my current research is looking at, are sporting workplaces family-friendly? The short answer is no. Look, there's a much longer answer, and of course, that's all grounded in rigid gender stereotypes, the caring economy, all that kind of stuff. But you're absolutely right, Sarah. And I know that, big shout out to Adam Bishop, again, one of my guests on last season's pod, around the work that he's done to really try and understand what is it that's preventing women from progressing to elite athlete coaches. He's part of Athletics Australia, and you're exactly right. Some of the practices around, when do we expect coaches to show up, and for how long, and that kind of stuff, combined with the current expectations on where women care, the 3 Cs, as I call them: cooking, cleaning, caring. How might we redesign all of that? So there's a call to action again: redesign the hiring, onboarding, and job for coaches, and you may well find that you're tapping into 52% of the population that you haven't already tapped into. So, Sarah, the work that you're doing to be both researcher and advocate, and I know that you have you've got a very strong voice around speaking out on what the right thing is to do and how we might be better. It takes guts and grit and determination to be an advocate for women in sport, and we often face duress. And you're a woman who's a lot younger than me, so and I look at you, and you and I've had these conversations. I really admire you, because when I was at the same age, I don't know that I was as courageous and as gritty and as determined as you are. I might have been on the inside, but I wasn't outwardly. As a woman navigating and taking a leadership role, what duress do you face, and how do you handle it?
Thank you, Michelle, for that question, and also for the kind words. I would say that for me, I experience duress a bit more subtly rather than overtly. And what I mean by that, it's more of a feeling that I get when I try to advocate or when I try to educate. And for me, one of the ways that I say subtly is I feel as though I'm being too much. And so I try to show up as professionally as I can in all that I do. I pride myself on professionalism. And I'm not saying, for certain it's because of my gender, but I do feel in certain situations that if a man were to approach that situation the same way that I do, that I'd be pretty confident in saying that it would be a much different conversation. It would be a much different feeling that both of us would walk away from that situation. I also feel like going back to being grateful, that's where it comes a lot into, feeling grateful for an opportunity or position, rather than, I've earned it. So for me, it's subtle ways that I see that duress rather than overtly, but again, acknowledging that that's not the case, or that is the case for, other women who do experience that overt duress in their places of work. And it's really unfortunate that that happens. I absolutely want to see action so that that doesn't happen, and that's not part of the conversation, moving forward. But for me, that's been my current experience.
As you were speaking about those subtle, and what we call either, second generation or third generation bias, I was reminded of when our first and only woman Prime Minister in Australia, the Honourable Julia Gillard, stood down. She graciously said, I want to make it easier. I hoped to make it easier for the next woman after me. But she also said, I know that my gender had something, didn't have everything to do with the way I was treated. I know my gender didn't have nothing to do with the way I was treated, but it had certainly had something to do with
Mm.
the way that I was treated. And I probably mangled that quote a little bit, but you're right. It's that subtle feeling of having to, particularly in environments where you are the minority. And I want to say, you and I, both white women, if we were women of color, disabled women, what have you, those layers, those intersecting layers of our identity would also create barriers. But the reality is, when you are a minority in a group that is the majority, we have to adopt certain behaviors, and those to assimilate, or assimilate to survive, kind of thing. So I think that's where gratitude comes in. Be grateful, and of course, part of this is the socializing that women and girls get from the outset of their lives about the role we play in society, the behaviors that are acceptable for women. So I hear that. How have you managed yourself through that? What do you do to say, okay, I recognize that I'm having thoughts and feelings, and there are some actions or behaviors coming from me as a result of that? Because let's face it, sometimes we can't change others. But how do you manage yourself, and what's your guidance to other women and girls who are listening to this saying, I want to take a leadership role, but I'm a bit scared? What do you do?
Yeah, so I want to thank my athletic background for the advice for this question. So for me, it becomes a bit of a game that I play in my head. Nobody else has to know that I'm playing this game, but it goes something like this. I'm very aware of the conversations that are taking place, very aware of the person that's on the other side of the table or across from me. And for me, it's how do I continue to advance myself? How do I get what I want out of this conversation? And so it shouldn't ever have to be, that I appear grateful and extremely humble, but I know what my end goal is. I know what I need to do in this particular situation, conversation, to move me forward. And so it's just the game that I play back in my head where, yes, I acknowledge that I may have to appear a bit more humble than I would normally like to be, or appear maybe not as, or to not speak as forcefully or as strong or as direct as I normally would like to be, or that I am, just to be able to, again, achieve what I want out of this conversation or this situation. So that's the first thing, is just, the mental game that you play, the self-talk that you have in your mind, being very
Mm,
aware of what's happening in the environment around you, but knowing what you need to do. I hate to say the word survive, but to be able to survive to eventually thrive in
mm,
your environment, whether it's that one or the one that you go to next. So that's the first thing. But a couple other things that I would say is allies have been something that's incredibly important to me. So allies looking both inside my place of work and outside my place of work. They've been instrumental to me to be able to lean on, to fact check, to see what they're seeing, and if I'm, can take another perspective into consideration, but to also just have my back, because it's not always easy, especially when you're trying to advocate for change. It's not an easy journey to do it alone. So finding those people inside your network and outside your network to continue to strengthen and ride the wave of advocacy. That's something that I would recommend looking into for your place of work. But again, outside your place of work is equally as important to have your support network. Standing my ground is another thing that I lean on. So for me, it's again going back to knowing my value, knowing what I bring to the table, and being so secure and confident in that, so that I'm this unmovable force. So whether it's bullet points that are written down and posted on my mirror, if you're a visual person, I'm visual, so that's something that I do. I have a I am whiteboard that I like to write, a couple of key things on for each week or each day, just to remind myself to stand firm and stand my ground. Because again, it can be a lonely journey, and there can be a lot of voices, a lot of chatter that's around you. So going back to knowing who you are can help you navigate and move through, difficult environments, and try to quiet that noise.
That's a great list. So number 1, be strategic. So, I'm going into a conversation or an exchange or an environment, and I am going to feel this way potentially. Who are they? What do I need? What do I need from them? What do they need from me? Planning, and I know you're a planner. So as I always say to folks, prior planning prevents poor performance. So you're being strategic about those conversations and those environments that you're in. I want to circle back to the second point, allies. You're finding your allies, and you're using those allies to sense check, fact check, but also simply to lean on, and hopefully advocate for you. As I said, I'm gonna loop back. Well, I've got a question to you about allies because we talk a lot about it. And number 3 is, really, I guess it falls into that prior preparation bit as well. But, who am I? What do I stand for? How do I show up? What's my value? And I know that's such a strong thing for you, Sarah, that for transparency, folks, Sarah and I work together in a number of different capacities, and I'm so fortunate to spend a good amount of time with her. So I know that she does focus very much on what value do I bring to this conversation, to this organisation, to what it is that I'm doing, but also being able to stand your ground because you know who you are, what you stand for, and the value that you bring. So there's 3 good strategies, folks. Now, I want to circle back to allies, because we hear a lot about allies, right? Get an ally, be a male ally, blah, 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 blah. What's your definition? No, actually, no. Start again, Michelle. How do you identify an ally?
How do I identify an ally? I think for me, my approach in identifying ally comes from conversation and also observation. So for me, when it comes to conversation, I'm listening to the way that this individual talks about, advancing women in sport, or in my case, advancing women's soccer. How are we moving the sport forward? So I'm listening to the way that they talk about it, listening to, do they have, practical considerations, like how in depth are they? So that's one thing when it comes to the allyship, is listening to those conversations and the way that they talk about, women in sport, women in leadership. The second is through observation, seeing what they're doing within the organization, or outside of the organization to support the game. So for me, are they showing up to Melbourne Victory women's matches? Are they posting about women's sport on social media, or are they talking about certain topics of conversation, whether it's gender equity or parity, etc.? What are they doing? So I'm looking at those actions too. That's outside of the conversations that we have, either individually one-on-one, or within our team. So those are 2 of the ways that I look at allyship, and whether or not I identify somebody as an ally. But with allyship, I do think that there is skill, there is an understanding to allyship, that it's not something that's necessarily you just go out and you do. I do think that the next step for organizations is then, what are those skills that we can teach, so that our coworkers know how to show up for our employees. So that's something else that I would say as far as organizations and what their next step could be around the topic of an ally.
Oh, what brilliant advice! And I seriously am going to write an article based on exactly that advice, Sarah, because I do have awesome men, and I know I've got to say awesome women who are probably my generation. So we're, as I've said already, a little older than you, Sarah, but we've got some runs on the board, and we do sit in a position of privilege and power and influence, and we want to give back. But we want it to be impactful and meaningful, not virtue signaling or kind of superficial. So I think though that real call to action there is understand what it takes to be an ally to underrepresented people, and you'll determine who that is. For me, it's around women and particularly marginalised women, um, and then what are the skills? So this is a nice segue into how do we level the playing field for women? And so, can you expand on? If you were going to write a playbook right now, a to-do list for an organization around leveling the playing field for women in sport, clearly teaching the skills around allyship would be part of that. What else would you tell them to do or ask them to do? I know we can't tell people, but ask people to do who are in organizations.
I think for me, what comes to my mind straight away is that mentorship, though. So for me, when it comes to allyship, I think mentorship's a little bit closely aligned with that. And by that, I mean, for myself personally, I know that there are things that I don't know about running a business, looking at the C-suite skills, for example. And so there's a bit of education for me that would be incredibly beneficial to help with my long-term game. So when it comes to those skills, there's also, I would say, education falls closely in line with that for me, to be able to help the trajectory of growing, those women in leadership positions, so that what I often see happen is, let's just hire, a woman for her gender. Like, instead of, looking at also, is she set up for success? Does she have those skills? Does she show that potential to be able to do well and excel in that position? Instead of just being the scapegoat of, she didn't do well. Oh, it's because she's a
Mm,
female. So I also just want to be set up for success in the future as well. That's not to say, that I have to have the whole full package before going for a position or being promoted. Not saying that at all, but it's to say I want to continue to grow and develop. And so I'm a go-getter and I just want more. And I know that there's other, women that are similar to myself who just want more out of this life, out of their work. And so continuing to invest in them and nurture them. But that, again, that's a skill, to be able to teach, educate. And I know that again takes time and investment. But even just setting aside that hour every month, like I do those sit downs with some people outside of my department, because I want to learn about the commercial part of the business. I want to learn about running the football club side of the business from the managing director. So sitting down and having those conversations will only make that organization better in the future.
Oh, you're talking my language now. Because of course, I mean, again, this is one of the things that I keep saying. Yes, we can mentor women, or we can really strategically mentor them and get them ready to run the business. The business of sport is big and it's complex and it's ambiguous and all that kind of stuff. But you know what? Men have been doing it for centuries, because they've had the right mentorship. And you're right, Sarah. So let's really start investing in skill building, as well as pairing women like you to say, hey, let's go and pair you with the CFO or the marketing officer or the strategy or whoever it may be. Let's teach you the business of sport so that you can transition from athlete maybe to coaching, but certainly into the business of sport. So there's your second call to action, listeners. Teach women the business of sport. What about us as individuals, Sarah? So there'll be all sorts of people listening to this, I hope. Um, what do we need to do as individuals to say, I just want to support women in sport? This is a freight train that is now on the tracks and full steam ahead. So, there's no going backwards, right? But we do need to accelerate progress. We do need to level this playing field. What can I do?
I think just being that role model, being that mentor, and again, understanding the skills aside for right now. But I think just by showing up in another person's life and checking in on them, celebrating them and their success or successes, just keeping track of their journey, keeping tabs on them, and just showing that you stand by them in what they're doing, I think can go a long, long way. That's one of the things I think that I hear a lot about with my research is I'm not saying because I haven't done extensive research when it comes to the men's side, so I don't know. But something that I commonly hear when it comes to women's sport is it feels like a sorority. Like we're coming
Mm.
alongside of each other, and it doesn't feel combative. Doesn't feel like you have to step on the other person to get ahead. And so by showing that solidarity and showing that you're supporting another person, I think that that's something that can help us, keep with, the turbulent times, the difficult times a little bit longer. Knowing that again, you're not alone in this journey, and that you have other people that are right there cheering you on, supporting you, right there alongside with you. So just showing up.
I agree, and showing up can mean all sorts of different things for me. I try to follow as many women in sport on social media and really, comment and like on their posts and things like that. If you've got the means, sponsor a woman. You can have jersey sponsors or player sponsors, uh, sponsor a club if you can, if you've got those kind of means. Go to matches or watch them, because of course not everyone has the means to go to a match, a sporting match. But gee whiz, with the digital enablement of sport, the casual fan can tune in all sorts of different ways. And by crikey, those metrics really matter. They matter to from a commercial perspective. So there are so many different ways to show up for women, and women in sport. So folks, it just takes a little bit of effort, but not a lot really. And if you, as I said, if you've got the means, put your money behind women in sport. So there you go. Sarah, last question, my favourite one. Well, no, they're all my favourite, but when I ask all my guests, what are you most hopeful for about women in sport?
So for this one, I'll circle it back to the women that I've interviewed for, this thesis. I'm thinking about the players specifically. So for me, it's giving the athletes the support and the respect that they deserve, because it's been a long time coming. And I know that this also stems back to when we're talking about hiring practices, putting the right people in charge, because if you get that right and get it right the first time, that will trickle down in everything, so that the little issues, the little things that we are seeing at from the player standpoint, that goes away. That goes away when we're hiring the right people. And yes, of course, a little bit of investment can go a long way as well. But this one's going to be, I'm looking ahead to the players and just making sure that everything's done right on the field and off the field to be able to support them and rally behind them.
Well, Sarah, thank you for your time with me today, but also thank you for your research and your advocacy and your leadership around women in sport and levelling the playing field for them. Where can we find you? So if someone wants to talk to you about your research, get you to speak at an event, contribute some kind of content, or simply just, hire you, quite frankly, where can we find you?
So you can find me on LinkedIn most easily. My name's Sarah Karlik. So just give me a search, give me a follow. Would love to connect with you and chat with you there. You can also follow me on my Instagram and Twitter. It's coaches_digest. And perhaps Michelle can put that in show notes
I'll
and
be putting them in
give
the
a
show
little.
notes. Yep,
Yep. So
absolutely.
then, so then we'd love to connect with you there as well.
Fantastic. Sarah Karlik, you're an amazing woman. You're an amazing young woman compared to me. I don't want to be patronising here. And as I said, if I'd had half the grit, determination, and courage and leadership that you have at your age, when I was your age, I don't know. I reckon I'd probably be president of the world by now. So, which is a scary concept, but thank you so much for your time. And I just really appreciate the work that you do. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.